So over to you, Davis.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm deeply disappointed that I'm not there in person. The irony of a conference on global peripheries, and I'm not able to actually be there in person is not lost on me. So I'd like to share some of the journey that we're taking on work we're doing related to the kind of African space ecosystem. And maybe just before that, just a little bit of background on how I got involved in the space sector. I originally studied physics and astrophysics at university. So, I always had a love for the sciences, I guess. And a lot of my interest had always been sparked by, the traditional American and European science fiction novels, Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov, and that whole, crowd of people really had me thinking, from a young age about, a world beyond us. Ended up studying physics, and then I moved away entirely from the sciences, and kind of jumped around a lot of different places. Worked in government and some startups, in strategy consulting, and kind of as I moved around, became more and more kind of interested in this challenge around really economic development, and why do we see such a big divide between people? And that was kind of reinforced by some of my studies. So I was at SOAS in the UK, which is well known for being a kind of very development focused university, and kind of so a lot of the work that drives me nowadays is trying to address this question of development and of growth of countries, but more importantly, of narrowing the gaps, narrowing divides, inequalities, and so on. And so this, this idea of what we've been talking about today around these peripheries and boundaries in particular, is something really quite close to my heart. And of course, when we think about boundaries, space is of course full of boundaries. We are, they're at the edge of land when we turn to the ocean. The edge of space between Earth and space, in the Kármán line, the edge of the solar system, and the heliopoles. Now, by definition, these boundaries are always at the periphery. They're away from wherever the core is. And one of the things that I think is notable is the fact that we as humans have mirrored this by creating all of our own boundaries that are, in many ways artificial. They're reinforced by existing power structures, and we've been doing this for countless generations. So I think one of the kind of catalysts that really changed some of my thinking is a Cambridge economist by the name of Ha-Joon Chang. He wrote a book, I don't know, it must be more than 15 years ago, called Kicking Away the Ladder. And within this book, he talks about the idea that various countries, and generally speaking, this is the global north, but really it's anyone with power, has always used some mechanism, some technological or soft power to achieve wealth and prosperity. And then they actively kick away this ladder that they use to climb the development pathway to maintain that power and prevent others from utilizing that same route. And again, it's very often the global south that is prevented from accessing this, but it's more just, whoever are the disenfranchised people. And, so over many decades, various forms of these ladders have been established and then, actively removed. So we can think about the creation of steam power 170, 180 years ago, that moved to industrialized manufacturing. And in all cases, the countries that have developed these technology bases use them to grow, to accumulate wealth and power, but then subsequently they will always try and put in place some mechanism to prevent other countries from getting that. So we saw steam, we saw industrialized manufacturing, computerization, and nowadays we're seeing a new example is, 5G networks, right? Where the US, for example, is pushing back hard against China and other countries to prevent some of these power dynamics from taking place. Now, this is not a commentary on US politics, but just noting that there is always a desire for those who have power to retain it, and they will do whatever they can to sort of maintain their position in the global pecking order. So, within that context, I think that the idea of a ladder is really quite suitable when we think about our aspirations related to space. Ladders are bridges that connect us from the soil up to the sky. In one perspective, they connect us from our past on the ground to whatever that future is above the ground. And, when we think about ladders, they always need to be placed on strong foundations. And in the context of, this dream of accessing space, that foundation is history, right? It's heritage. It's, actual flight time in space. And one of the things that I realized over the last 7 or 8 years, having been working in the space sector in Africa, is that the knowledge of that history is very much missing from African discourse. And of course, if you go back, centuries, there is a lot of, acknowledgement and recognition of the role that Africans have played in our understanding of space, deep roots in astronomy, of the mathematics that enable space technology. But these kind of histories are so far back that they've turned into legend and myth, right? They are not practically useful, right? And I think that between sort of these myths of the past and our dreams of the future lies actual memory. It lies a practical mechanism via which people today, have remembered how to do a certain thing, of struggles, of how they overcame those struggles, not just tells of the past. And I think that active memory is something that has just been, in many cases, lost in regards to the role that Africa has played in the kind of global space sector. And there really is a lot. Now, I'll touch on some of the work that we've been doing around this. So I think that there are, for me, 2 reasons why it's so important for us to understand what this heritage is of our contributions. The first is that, it's very difficult to build any kind of future, whether that's engineered in technology or imagined through cultures and kind of more creative pursuits, if you don't actually have a grounding and a locus in which you are able to identify yourself in that place. And so, whether it's about putting satellites in space and using them, or inspiring people to locate themselves in the stories we tell ourselves about science and science fiction in space, this requires a strong understanding of what our history is. And so I think that if you speak to the average citizen of an African nation, many of them will have no idea that their country and their continent has not only been an active player in the global space sector, but have really meaningfully contributed to this ecosystem over, certainly the last 70 years, that there's been an active ecosystem. And even before that, if we think about, for example, astronomy and so on. So, this uncovering of the history is what's been really important for me and kind of the sort of one of the core drives of this particular program. Of course, history is not the only aspect. Building out a vibrant ecosystem requires much more than just, history. It requires political will, and it requires capital and funding and engineers and entrepreneurs and artists and all these different people to come together. But I think it is grounded by this memory. So to that end, myself and some colleagues have been working on this project over the last 9 months to map and publicly document the history of the various space activities across Africa. So this involves us engaging with, what literature does exist. And there is some work that has been published by various space agencies and by various academics. It's by talking to people who've been involved in these programs over the last 50 or 60 years. Many of the CEOs of different space agencies across the continent and multilateral organizations who've been involved in this, and basically creating a single publicly accessible repository of all of this information that allows people to have a base from which to build a future in space. Of course, the initial stage, and we really are in the middle of this, so you're seeing a work in progress. The first stage of this is to publish all of this information on something like Wikipedia in multiple languages, and making sure that it is accessible to at least a portion of people that way. But that is really just the raw data. The longer term vision is to create a much richer narrative on top of that raw data, and to start finding interesting stories that emerge from that, and to inform a much broader engagement with space amongst African citizens. One of the things that strikes me very often here in South Africa, and I've seen it elsewhere, is people will often walk around with NASA t-shirts, not knowing that, there is a South African space agency, and in Kenya it's the same, and in Ghana it's the same. And so, there's this knowledge is really important to move around. So there really are some amazing histories that have kind of emerged over time, and sort of in this process. So just to give an idea of some of the ways that that Africa has contributed to our global sort of space knowledge, going back many years. So probably the first kind of like well-established contribution towards space science was around the Hermanus Magnetic Observatory, which was established in South Africa in 1841, so 180 years ago. But then coming up much more recently, in the early 1960s, Italy, together with the Kenyan government, established a launch facility off the coast of Kenya at Malindi, which is the San Marco Luigi Broglio facility. It's managed by the Italian Space Agency, but the government of Kenya has been an active partner in that. And in fact, that facility is currently being explored as a potential new equatorial launch site for Kenya. In both Nigeria and South Africa, since the early 1960s, there was the establishment of some of the deep space network tracking satellites, or ground stations. There have been a number of major intergovernmental programs. So one of them is the Regional Center for Mapping and Resources Development, which was established in 1975 across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Somalia, and Malawi, and now stretches across essentially the entire eastern coast of Africa, from Egypt all the way down to South Africa. And through part of these programs, for example, through groups such as ICMRD, Africa was the first continent to be fully mapped from space, as part of work done with Food and Agricultural Organization. And I haven't even touched on the range of more traditional astronomical topics. There are all sorts of really amazing radio and optical telescopes that, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, Ghana, a number of countries are now part of the biggest square kilometer array that stretches from South Africa northwards, and is also in Australia. So these kind of stories and histories that we are uncovering, they only account for a small fraction of what we know has happened. I was talking with some of the people from the Kenyan Space Agency, and they have an archive room full of original sort of satellite imagery that they can no longer access because the reading machines no longer work from the early 70s. There's all these like little gems and stories that create such a rich narrative. But no one knows this. And so if we are able to start kind of creating this broader narrative, we really get to a point where Africa is no longer seen as being an emerging space nation, but countries that have been actively involved in space since the beginning. Africa is no longer seen as being at the periphery of space, but it's been core and central to many of the programs that have been developed. And, even if we move beyond the idea of servicing a bigger global kind of sector, one of the big shifts that we're hoping to achieve or contribute towards is shifting the narrative around the locus of where people see themselves in the space community. When we see all of the media, whether it's film, whether it's television, whether it's books, there is very little aspirational media produced from a science fiction and from a speculative fiction point of view that takes place within Africa and locates Africans within those stories. And that means that people don't see themselves in that role. They see Captain America, and they see, it's a silly example, but those are the stories that the 10-year-olds of today are watching and are being inspired to go do great things. And yet, we don't have that base, that history that allows us to create that narrative in the future. And so a really important aspect of this, beyond just, the technology heritage, which is important in getting people into science and those kinds of elements, which are, coming from that background is very important to me. But there's the inspirational idea that is much more important about how do we remind people that they have already walked this path? How do we show to people that they're not kind of forging a new path, but following in the footsteps of their ancestors? And I think that this is a really important kind of perspective that, we're helping to contribute towards.
Davis, can I interject for a second? Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay, I think
Yes.
I'll have to request you to slowly wrap up.
No problem.
Yeah, okay.
So I think that the one last thing that I wanted to kind of mention is that, the idea here is that, if I loop it back to the idea of ladders, is we should really be building our own ladders. It shifts the idea around who is in core, who is in the periphery. And, this knowledge that is being uncovered helps us to realize that we as kind of African citizens are really at the heart of our own space aspirations. And that means that it's going to be a lot more difficult for anyone to kick away those ladders because they're grounded in very deep African soil. So that's part of our journey. I do encourage you in a few months, once the sites are finalized, that, go look up the history of Africa in space. Understand what those ideas are. And for anyone who wants to help contribute, it's an open call to capture these stories and help remember a past that is remarkable.
Thank you, Davis. Is there a website
Recording
that
stopped.
people could actually go and respond to this call, or is there how do they look up some of the stuff that you've already put out there and what you're sort of soliciting through your call?
Sure. So we chose to go with Wikipedia because it is the most stable and broadly accessible site. The existing articles on various countries' histories is currently being reviewed by the Wikipedia editors and will be loaded. So at a point, we don't want to own this. Right? This history cannot be owned by Davis and Reese and like our team. This needs to be something that is communal, that is broadly owned, which is why we've used Wikipedia. If anyone does want to get involved, you can, of course, directly contact me, and I'm happy to share contact details for that. But the point of this is not that it is our research. This is just something that we've contributed into a broader community.
Thank you. I think, Davis, there's a very interesting similar thing going on in India where we are recording, a bunch of us, memory monologues of retired ISRO scientists who are now in their 80s and 70s, and such amazing stories are being recorded.
Yeah.
And now we are starting to broadcast it on the internet. So I think let's talk a little bit about narratives, and then I will have the audience ask questions. So I think if you look at narratives, we need to recenter the narrative. I mean, I come from a country which has one of the oldest space programs in the world. We are going to launch humans in a couple of years. We make our own satellites. We launch our own rockets. We launched a Brazilian satellite recently. And we have our own GPS constellation, and the world doesn't quite know about it, because I think a couple of things, Davis. Probably one of the things is the cultures we come from are somewhat introverted compared to those who are megaphonic and go out and just look at the Artemis program. We have yet to launch the Artemis rocket, but the amount of discussion that you hear around the Artemis program way outweighs, let's say, what China has done. You know, China has landed on the moon 3 times, three successive successes, which is incredible, because the technology to make soft precision landings on planetary surfaces is still very challenging. And they've brought back samples, which nobody has done in 40 years. But again, the narrative is so tilted towards Artemis. I mean, geopolitics aside, very few people in the world know that China has been to the moon 3 times recently and brought back samples. So I think similarly in Europe, I worked for the International Space Station program with Boeing, and almost 80% of the hardware is made here in Torino, in Italy. How many of the Europeans even know that that's the case? Everybody thinks NASA is the do-all and end-all of everything. And I think that's partially because of Hollywood and the way Hollywood drives narratives, you know, and how they oversimplify and stereotype. For example, if it's a typical Hollywood, what we in India call masala film, you will see the Chinese will be reduced to a couple of floating chopsticks, or the Russians will be reduced to a couple of floating chess pieces. While that's not the case, and I think it's really about narratives and about capturing what you said, history and memory, and broadcasting it to the people to be able to recenter the narrative, isn't it? I mean,